So I want to backtrack a little bit here, and I want us to stretch our minds back before Christianity, back before any other world religion had entered Alaska, and ask ourselves what was here before, and to some degree what still persists. When we look at the pre-colonial spiritual traditions across the many different Alaska Native groups, we see that there was incredible amounts of diversity and uniqueness. You cannot sort of ask the question, what did Alaska Natives believe about X, Y, or Z? Because there might be, 20 or a dozen different beliefs on that, depending on what culture group or language group you're talking about. At the same time, there were some common themes, or at least recurring themes, meaning they maybe weren't in every religious tradition across Native Alaska, but they were in many. So I'll identify three that stand out to me. One of which is what I call a fluid mythic time. So mythic does not mean fictional in anthropological terms. What we mean by that is simply a sacred story of something that happened basically a long time ago, most likely. And so when we talk about mythic time, I'm using the terminology of Alan Boris here. But basically the idea that there was a time in the sacred stories long before the present in which things were fluid. And what I mean by fluid is the idea that animals and humans were not nearly as separated as they are now, where we generally can't communicate with each other unless we have special spiritual gifts in some traditions. But instead, at that time, things like in your Degzanog story you read, Raven can talk to human beings and human beings can talk to Raven, right? So time where the animals, shall we say, were not quite so animal-like, and the humans, shall we say, were not quite so human-like, and they were both rather like each other in a lot of ways. So that's a common theme in many of these traditions. Another is the importance of respecting animals that have been killed for hunting or fishing. And that's often, although not always, connected to the ideas of reincarnation, or the idea, not necessarily of reincarnation. I'm actually going to edit that literally while we're talking with each other. It's not necessarily always reincarnation, but the idea that animals that are respected, that the spirits will see that and send more animals, or that the animal spirits themselves will see that and want to offer themselves again to that same group of people, or maybe even that the animal spirits themselves will reincarnate. But the idea here, the connection between respecting the animals, the animal spirits or spirits associated with the animals perceiving that, and then the human group continuing to be successful, sort of interdependency formulated through spiritual rituals. Now, point number 3, kind of a common theme, is the idea that the world is animated and spiritual. It's always hard when you're using English terms. Spiritual, what does that mean? That sort of makes us think of the Christian dualism of the body and soul. In this context, it's not entirely dissimilar, but we're kind of talking about the idea. I sometimes like to use the term instead of sentience, although that doesn't always work, but the idea that animal and other kinds of nature beings have sentience or personality to them that may not be sort of always immediately obvious to the naked eye. And so a world that's animated, a world that's spiritual. These are some common themes, but again, each spiritual tradition was diverse, each was unique. You don't want to assume too much about different traditions based on kind of a few common elements, in the same way that, for example, if we're talking about Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other Abrahamic religions, we can point out that they share in common the biblical figure of Abraham, the idea of the monotheistic God, and a variety of other aspects of their sacred stories. And yet, at the same time, anyone that's even reasonably conversant in religion will tell you that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are very different from each other and even very diverse within themselves. And so, noting some common themes doesn't mean they're the same. It's just to note that in this part of the world, a lot of Alaska Native groups did converge on a few kind of common themes, similar to how other regions also kind of converged on a few common themes. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about that diversity, though, kind of just to, belabor the point and so forth. When we think, for example, of Tlingit sacred traditions, which we spoke about a few weeks ago, we talked a lot about the significance of Raven as a creator figure, and a very important figure. We also talked about the importance of the concept of balance, and so the idea that things are sort of cosmically all in balance with each other, whether it's through the Moiety system, where you have Raven marrying into Eagle Moiety and Eagle Moiety marrying into Raven Moiety, whether it's throwing potlatches one after the other for an honored dead member of your society, of your moiety, things have to be balanced. Compensations, balancing acts, all of it facilitated, at least in part, through the shamans. and also the concept of ata'u, something, knowledge or ceremonies which is purchased or owned, kind of this idea that in sacred time, sometimes people had gone through enormous effort, sometimes even lost their life, to gain possession of certain ceremonial knowledge, certain ways of doing certain religious practices that they passed on, not so much to the entire society as it was through their specific clan or lineage. And so this idea of ownership of sacred knowledge, which is, interesting and kind of different than how some world religious traditions think of religious knowledge as something you're supposed to just sort of throw out as widely as possible. So it's a very interesting take on sacredness. We can contrast that with the Naina sacred traditions, which certainly shares elements of respecting nature and that nature will continue to allow itself to be harvesting if you respect nature, but also some really different aspects, such as the importance within the Naina sacred traditions of the being of Kunkta Jelen, the mother of the animals, the concept of Kechatanen, which we talked about towards the start of the semester, the true believer, people that could exercise certain kinds of spiritual gifts, such as clairvoyant dreaming or shamanism, if they sort of had true intentions and true understandings of the spiritual world and of the interconnections between the spiritual world. And we talked about the idea of Begeisha and Begeisha, this idea of sort of a scent or a supernatural signal that is sent to other beings as a result of objects and their histories. And so these two examples, Tlingit sacred traditions and Dena'ina sacred traditions, definitely have some common themes, but it does them both a disservice to suggest that they're the exact same, because they're not. They both have really rich traditions of their own. And that's equally true when we look at Yupik's traditions prior to colonialism. So I had you do the reading by I gave you the option of doing the Harold Napoleon reading, which was written, Harold Napoleon, who had been a really prominent Yupik politician in the 70s, he ended up going to jail for many years. And he, while in jail, wrote extensively about Yupik. He wrote this really long essay, really a book, about sacred traditions of Yupik and kind of relating that to crises within Yupik and more broadly Alaska Native communities. And this was written in the mid-90s, so I want to emphasize that not everything he says is current and up to date, but it's an interesting snapshot in time of how one person is perceiving what he sees as a fundamentally sort of spiritual issue going on in Alaska Native communities, as particularly his own Yupik communities, from the perspective of somebody that had spent a lot of time in prison, and spent a lot of time by that point with a lot of other folks that were in prison, of course, and talked to them about their life stories. So he kind of looks at it through a spiritual lens. But to kind of set that up, as you read about if you did do the reading, or maybe you didn't, because as I say, you don't have to do the reading. There's a lot of things in that reading that may be triggering for some people to read about. So whether you did the reading or not, he talks about sort of prior to colonialism, when we look back at Yupik traditions, and this is, something that we know partly through oral histories that have still been partially handed down. This is partly something we know through really early anthropologists and explorers that were interacting with the Yupik right before or right after they Christianized. But we know that there was this concept of Yuyurak, which he calls the way of the human being, and he says he compares it to the Mosaic law of Judaism, meaning the Ten Commandments as well as all the other laws and commandments received by the prophet Moses that form much of the first 5 books of the Bible, or rather the number 2, 3, 4, and 5. So Yuyurak, the way of the human being, which regulates how people relate to each other, even as specific as how a nephew relates to an uncle, a cousin with a cousin, which cousins count as which kind of cousins, as well as how you relate to the animals, the geologic landforms, the spirits, the dead, the ceremonies that you do to honor the dead, because their spirits sort of still they're permanent, they can't be dissolved. And so all these ideas are sort of the way that you properly interact with the cosmos around you and with the social cosmos and the environmental cosmos. And part of the idea there is this idea of Inruk, which he talks about, the idea of spirit or breath, which, by the way, using the same term either for spirit or breath here is not unusual at all within the book of Genesis, for example, when it says that the spirit in the first chapter, that the spirit of God is moving upon the waters, you could also translate that as like the breath of God is moving on the waters. And in the New Testament, the term that's often sometimes the term for like Holy Spirit is also like holy breath. So there's often in many cultures, this kind of connection between the idea of spirit and breath. You sometimes get some of those same ideas within Hinduism, especially within yogic or yoga traditions. So anyways, that's not unusual. So within Yupik culture, though, this idea of your breath or your spirit, the thing that departs from you when you die, But for certain types of being, including animals and prey species, that spirit is indissoluble. It is eternal. It is not destroyable. It exists and it will continue to exist. And that's one of the reasons you need to honor and respect through a yearly ceremony the spirits of the dead. And a lot of these different kinds of ways of relating to the world and ways of honoring the world and honoring the spirits is mediated through the type of being, which, as Napoleon puts out, called Ankelkuk, which we typically translate just as shaman. But as he points out, you could also think of them as healers, as judges, as leaders. They're kind of a lot of different things traditionally in Yupik society. As he puts it, the village historians, physicians, judges, arbitrators, and interpreters of Yuyurak, of this total spiritual way of life. And within this spiritual way of life, those shamans, among other things, helped to cure diseases which were believed to be spirit-caused. So certainly folks recognize that, you eat rotten meat, you get sick. You eat certain kinds of plants that are poisonous, and you get sick, potentially die. But there was the idea that a lot of other sicknesses, there was no obvious cause. You hadn't eaten poison, you hadn't been injured. So there was a sense that many other kinds of misfortune were spirit-caused, especially many other kinds of diseases, and thus you needed a shaman to help cure them, who would sometimes do different forms of surgery, amputation kind of things, or bone setting or different things, or apply herbal medicines, or also do sacred ceremonies. Now, so it was very much a way of life in which the perpetuation of people's health and well-being was a central concern, and one that was explained in large part through spirits and the working of spirits and the working of shamans, which then brings the question, which Napoleon talks about, of what happens when there's a major medical catastrophe that the system can't fix. So in a sense, the system, the sacred system, was working for centuries as far as giving a way for people to be healed of and come to grips with and understand their medical conditions, as well as much more bigger, just sort of their social lives and how to relate to the world around them. People, as much as we want things like healing and prosperity, and certainly this system helped to ensure that, we also just want to understand things and feel like we kind of have a handle on the way the world works. Most of us don't do too well in sort of a complete existential crises of uncertainty. So he talks about sort of this gave a sense of how to relate to things, which was mediated through the shamans who promulgated this way of life. But then there was major epidemics and sort of how that brought about, as he puts it, really kind of a destruction of that traditional sacred system. But before we get there, I want to read this quote. He says, there, meaning Yupik, world was complete. It was a very old world. They called it Yuyurak, the way of being a human being. Although unwritten, this way can be compared to Mosaic law because it governed all aspects of a human being's life. It defined the correct behavior between parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, mothers-in-law, daughters and sons-in-law. It defined the correct behavior between cousins. There were many cousins living together in a village. It determined which members of the community could talk with each other, which members could tease each other. It defined acceptable behavior for all members of the community. It outlined the protocol for every and any situation that human beings may find themselves. So again, that idea that I started with of religious traditions that don't sort of stay put for one day or one ceremony, but instead are sort of permeate the entire culture. He says, Yuyurak defined the correct way of thinking and speaking about all living things, especially the great sea and land mammals on which the Yupik relied for food, clothing, shelter, tools, kayaks, and other essentials. These great creatures were sensitive, they were able to understand human conversations, and they demanded and received respect. Yuyurak prescribed the correct method of hunting and fishing and the correct way of handling all fish and game caught by the hunter in order to honor and appease their spirits and maintain a harmonious relationship with them. So again, sort of giving both understanding and fitting in well with your surroundings or your cosmos. And one more quote. To the Yupit, the world visible to the eye and available to the senses showed only one aspect of being. Unseen was the spirit world, a world just as important as the visible, if not more so. In fact, Yupik life was lived in deference to this world and the spirit beings that inhabited it. What the white men saw was not the worship of the devil, but a people paying attention, being mindful of the spirit beings of their world with whom they had to live in harmony. So I want to pick up on that final theme. What the white men saw was not the worship of the devil. So early missionaries often conceptualized what Yupik ceremonies were doing as devil worship within sort of a Christian framing. And that's not unusual or strange. That certainly happened in many cases when Christian missionaries encountered indigenous people, although interestingly, not necessarily always, but sometimes. So for them, they saw a ceremony which they couldn't understand, perhaps a ceremony which seemed rather ecstatic, by which I mean people were dancing and singing, a ceremony in which there was gods that they were not familiar with or spirits that they were not familiar with, and it looked like what was being venerated was demons or the devil. And so there was a lot of very serious cultural misunderstanding that led to suppression of the native religion because outsiders viewed it as something evil that was happening. And he's saying that's not what it was at all. It was a way of sort of venerating and paying attention to the spirits around you that are in nature. So that's one example of the many, many different spiritual traditions that existed pre-colonialism. But as I said before, with colonialism, sort of everything changed. And, within the really short span of, again, at max about 270 years, but really a lot shorter than that for groups like the Yupik, religious demographics had completely changed, and the vast majority of Alaska Native people had Christianized, had converted to Christianity. So we then have to ask ourselves a number of questions, which we will after I stop and restart the video.